morning, everyone. This is the Liberty's Last Refuge podcast, and I am your host, Chris Manning. Thanks so much for joining me today. It's been a little while since my last video. I've been taking a little bit of time off when I was on vacation. And now it's time to get back into it, try and get a little bit more consistent again. And I want to talk, this is going to be a football podcast, obviously. I've got my BYU Cougar shirt on. And this last week, I read an article by Ross Dellinger, who was talking about the problems of the upcoming playoff format for college football. And like most of the writers, he has no solutions. He just wants to point out the things as he sees as the flaws in the system. And he makes a couple points that I want to go over. Obviously, I've already done my video on what I think the optimum playoff system should be. 16 teams. You get 8 automatic qualifiers, and you get 8 next highest bids. And the automatic qualifiers are the conference champions. So the 8 highest ranked conference champions would get that automatic spot. They would also get the home game. I will go ahead and link that episode in the show notes. So if you want to go ahead and rewatch that and see what my ideal for the playoff system is going to be, you can go ahead and check that out. Now, I want to go over his article, and then I want to actually kind of do a little bit more pretending if I was the dictator-in-chief of college football, the NCAA, and I could make college football look like whatever I wanted. What would that look like as far as conference alignments? Because we are going to have another round of conference alignment. So I went through and I did a series of tests and analysis on all of the teams over the last 20 years. I took 20 years of data. I gave some certain criteria. If you did X, then you got more points. Anyways, we'll get into that in more detail later. But first, I want to go over Ross's article. So here's Ross's article. It's the expanded 12-team college playoff is here, and it already has problems. Now, one of the things that he mentions that I brought up several times over my advocating and the videos I put for creating a 16-team playoff is the number of rematches that are likely going to happen if you keep a 12-team playoff with only the 5 highest ranked conference champions getting an AQ, and then having 7 additional next highest ranked. Well, consolidation has led to a greater chance of rematches within the conference unless there is some finagling of the rankings in order to avoid a rematch, which I don't think they should actually do. Again, with a 16 team, 8 by 8, you have less of these rematches because you just have fewer fewer teams from the same conference going to get in, which I think is a good thing, and it would eliminate one of the issues that he brings up. The second thing that he brings up that I agree with is this rule too, that the CFP selection committee is still making the selection. And I have talked about how I think the CFP selection is garbage. Most of them don't know what they're doing. They don't actually watch the game, since most of them are athletic directors. They've got athletic departments to manage, and so they aren't watching a whole lot of football. So I always do my rankings based on the AP. You've got a much larger data set. You have less likely for any 1 or 2 or 3 people's biases, and I point out those terrible rankings often can submarine a good team or a G5 team, which should be ranked, because the selection committee will almost never select a G5 team, no matter how good they are. And that is a bias that I think we need to get rid of, because the idea that only half of the teams in college football should be permitted to even play for a national championship is garbage, because we don't have that mentality in any other sport in college sports. But somehow college football is this unique alien that we treat completely different just because it makes a lot of money. No, we shouldn't. If you play in this division, you should get an opportunity, a legitimate opportunity, if you have a good team, to play for a national championship. And then here in the article is the one I want to highlight the most. And this is where Ross Dellinger talks about how much he has no desire to see any of the G5 teams get into the playoffs. He says, but perhaps the most pressing issue sure to rise with the new 12-team bracket is the lowly ranked G5 champion inclusion, pushing out a power league team ranked in the top 12. Now, again, I've stated many times, if you win your conference, you should get a playoff spot. Again, I said the top 8. And I have shown the history over the last, 15, 20 years that almost always the top 2 G5 champions are going to be in the top 25. And occasionally it's the top 3. So you can't sit here and tell me that a conference champion who is ranked in the top 25, one of the top 25 teams in all of college football, when we have very little crossover. Okay, so you don't have like basketball where you get a lot of crossover and you can kind of compare teams and conferences. You can't get that in college football. So I think it is ridiculous to say that the majority of the teams in college football and most of the kids who are playing will never have an opportunity to play for a national championship. You're allowing just a single team from half of the teams in college football an opportunity at the playoff. That isn't fair. It isn't right. Just because you have joined a power conference back in the 1930s doesn't mean that you actually deserve to remain in one of those conferences. And that's kind of what my analysis that I did over the last 20 years is going to show. Okay, so now I want to get into the analysis of what I did and how I broke out to determine who would be the most deserving teams to be considered in the power conferences. Now, there are 134 teams playing in the FBS division this coming year. So if I was going to do it perfectly, we would have had 67 teams who would be in the, say, P5, and then we would have had another 67 teams that were in the G5. And so I wanted to do this thought analysis where I'm going to go ahead and create the perfect conference alignment. And that's what this is. This is creating the perfect conference system for these power conferences. And I just stuck with what would be considered the P6. I brought back the Big East. Those of you who don't know the BCS and the BCS era, the Big East was considered one of the 6 automatic qualifying conferences. So we actually did have 6 what would be considered the P6. I just focused on them, and I wanted to get it exactly even, where the 6 conferences each had 12 teams. And some of the criteria I had is obviously, in order to be in the conference, did we have a historical connection to the conference? Did you win that conference championship? Did you ever have a playoff appearance, a BCS appearance, or a national championship? And then the last thing I considered was, how many times have you been in the AP over the last 20 years? Now, the caveat here is I completely threw out everything from the 2020 season. So this goes from 2023 to 2003. So those 20 years, not including 2020. So all of the caveats I have, 2020 is not considered in any of this analysis. So the AP rankings in 2020 done. Any conference championship, not considered. The playoff teams that played in 2020, not considered. So it's 2003 to 23. And this is looking just strictly, have you been a team which performed? I don't care about whether or not you were good in the 1940s, looking at you, Texas A&M Army. Okay, just because you were good in the 1940s, or you started football in 1896 and you're been around forever, say Indiana, that doesn't mean that you're a better program over the last 20 years than, say, UCF, who just recently started playing football. So I took this analysis, and I'm going to break it down for you and show you how I got the consideration for the teams. And we actually ended up, when I did this analysis and all the teams that met the criteria, we are going to end up with 73 teams that are in the P6. So I'll go through that breakdown and how many teams each inclusion of the new criteria added. All right, so the first consideration that I had for inclusion into the Power 6 was, have you won a national championship in the last 20 years? So I went back all the way to 2003, and I went based on the AP polls number 1. So when you have the the split championship between LSU and USC, USC gets the nod over LSU. Back in, I believe that was 2004, excuse me. So over that time, there are only 11 teams that have won a national championship in the last 20 years. So these 11 teams were the automatic qualifiers, in essence, into the P6. You won a national championship in the last 20 years, you are a power conference team. So those teams are Alabama, LSU, Georgia, Florida, and Auburn from the SEC, Clemson and FSU from the ACC, Ohio State and Michigan from the Big Ten, Texas from the Big 12, and then USC from the Pac-12. So that was the first criteria. The next was I looked at if you made the playoffs. So if you are a team that has made the playoffs, the 14 playoff, since the inception of the playoffs, you also got included. This then brought in Notre Dame and Michigan State, Oklahoma, TCU, Cincinnati, Oregon, and Washington. So in the last 20 years, and also the BCS teams. So if you played in the BCS and you lost, you were still included in this group of, in essence, the elite. These are the 18 teams. In the last 20 years, there are only 18 teams who have played in the BCS playoffs and won a national championship. 18. That is it. So these would be your top tier, if you will, of the power conferences. The next criteria was, have you won a conference championship? So maybe you never made it to a playoff, you never made it to the BCS, but in the last 20 years, have you won a conference championship? And so if you have won one of the power conferences, this included the Big East. So I went and looked at the Big East champions back in the day in the early 2000s. Then you got the next nod. And so including in that next group of conference champions, that expanded the field now to 39 teams. So in the last 20 years, there are only 39 teams that have won a conference championship in those upper conferences. So we still needed more teams. So the next criteria then was, how many times have you finished the year, the final AP ranking in the top 25? And so each year that you got, you finished in the top 25, maybe you never won a conference championship, like Tennessee. Tennessee has never won the SEC championship in the last 20 years, but they've been ranked 8 times in the final AP poll. So they were then included. And I added those up. Now, even then, there still wasn't enough teams to get me to 72 teams. So then I incorporated also the G5. Now the G5, because they have played in what would be considered the lesser division, they had additional criteria to be considered. Not only, they couldn't just win one conference championship like, say, Miami. Miami has won one conference championship in 20 years. Cal and ASU, one conference championship. Iowa, one. Wake Forest, one. Georgia Tech, one. But we considered them all part of the power conferences. To be considered from a G5 division, you had to have won your conference multiple times. And you had to be ranked in the top 25 multiple times. So they have a more stringent criteria. So when I finally did all that, I added that, we got to 73 teams. So nearly perfect for exactly what I wanted. And so I created the 6 divisions. Now, when I created the conferences, I wanted to do the criteria of who got put into which conference. So again, this is me pretending that I have the power to shuffle the deck however I want and create the perfect 6 power conferences in college football. So the considerations I had was a historical connection to the conference. So we had 6 BCS conferences. So at that time, that was basically the starting point for this. The next thing was your geography. I wanted geographical compactness because that's one of the things that I think is going to be a big issue, not so much for football, but for all of the other sports in the conferences. They're going to find out that traveling from LA to Rutgers is not going to be something that the swim team wants to do, or the cross-country team, or the soccer team. And it's going to put a lot of stress and strain, and student athletes are going to miss a lot of class time. And I think eventually people are going to understand that this is not the best model. Just because we can cram 18 teams into a conference doesn't mean that it is the best. I think the ideal is 12 teams. So each of these conferences will have between 11 and 13 teams. The next consideration was rivalries. Unfortunately, with realignment, we have forgotten about one of the greatest things about college football is the rivalries. So if you have one of the top 20 rivalries in college football, I did everything I could to put you in the same conference. So we got in-state schools that maybe haven't been in the same conference ever or for a long time. If you have a history of having a rivalry with that team, I did my best to put you into the same conference. Okay, so pretending that I am the dictator-in-chief of the NCAA and I can arrange and put teams wherever I want into whatever conference I want, and I can create these 6 conferences, this is what it would look like. All right, so we're going to start with the ACC. And I also kind of ranked these teams based on all the metrics that I had. Again, national championship, playoff appearances, conference championships, and the number of times ranked in the top 25. With the team that had the most points then is at the top, and the team that was at risk of getting kicked out is at the bottom. So here we have the ACC. It looks very, very similar to today's ACC or the ACC of a few years ago with some minor tweaks. So Clemson, Florida State, and again, because I am the dictator-in-chief, Notre Dame, you are forced to join the ACC with your football team. Now, Notre Dame competes in the ACC with every one of their other sports are part of the ACC. So we just removed Notre Dame's independence and put them into the ACC. Then you have Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech had 4 conference championships. You have Wake Forest, Miami. Now, the new addition is Miami gets an in-state team in UCF. UCF had several conference championships while they were part of the G5, and they had 5 times where they finished in the top 25. So every 4 years, UCF is finishing in the top 25. Then you have NC State, and then you have Maryland, North Carolina, Duke, and Virginia. Now you might say, well, UCF doesn't deserve it, but in the last 20 years, North Carolina, Duke, and Virginia have never won a conference championship, and they have each only finished the season ranked in the AP Top 25 one time. So yes, UCF, particularly it's one of the largest institutions. It's in Florida. They've had 2 undefeated seasons, right? Won 20-some games in a row, and I think they got robbed in, 2017, and an opportunity if we had an expanded playoff. UCF should have gotten at least an opportunity. They had won 22, 23, 24 games in a row, something like that, and they weren't even considered. Again, the new system would correct that. So that would be the ACC. As you see, they've got the 12 teams, which I think is the perfect number of teams. Then we have the Big East. So we've revived the Big East, and Cincinnati is the top team in the Big East. And West Virginia in the early to mid 2000s was a consistent top 25 team. They had, I believe it was 7 or 8. I believe it was 7 times that they finished in the top 25. Then you have Louisville. And what's great about this is now you also have Pittsburgh. So you have the West Virginia Pitt rivalry every year. That is a conference game. Again, bringing back those rivalries was important. And then you have Syracuse and BC, Rutgers. So Syracuse, New York, Rutgers, New Jersey. You got some closeness there. You've got Boston College and UConn. UConn gets pulled out of the misery of independence. And then you have Kentucky and Louisville in the same conference, because Kentucky in the last 20 years only has 2 years that they finished in the top 25. That's it. They have no conference championships. So because Kentucky was the lower end of the SEC, they got shuffled over to the Big East, and that creates that in-state game with Louisville. And you have Memphis and Vanderbilt. So Memphis has multiple conference champions. They get the call up from the G5 up to the P6. And now you have Vanderbilt, which was, again, in the same place as Kentucky, only 2 top 25 appearances in the last 20 years. They get moved over to the Big East. So the Big East needed some teams, so the additions are Kentucky, Memphis, and Vanderbilt. Again, a lot of compactness, geographic compactness, in-state rivalries, cross-border rivalries between West Virginia and Pitt. Perfect. Next is the new look SEC. Now, there's not a whole lot of difference between the SEC of a few years ago, but obviously Alabama is the cream of the crop. then LSU, Georgia, Florida, and Auburn. They've all won national championships. They've all won the conference multiple times, and those are the only 5 teams in the last 20 years who have won a conference in the SEC. Then you have Tennessee. Tennessee had 8 finishes in the AP Top 25. Ole Miss was next at 7, and Missouri, I believe, had 6. South Carolina 5, Arkansas 4, Mississippi State 4, and then Georgia Tech. So the Georgia Tech rivalry is now a conference game. So we get that game every year, and Georgia, basically we've swapped Georgia Tech and Vanderbilt. Next is going to be the Big Ten. This is Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, Wisconsin, Penn State, Iowa. Now all of those teams have won a conference championship. Obviously Ohio State and Michigan have national championships, and Michigan State has a playoff appearance. Then we have Nebraska. Now Nebraska had 6 finishes in the AP, but it hasn't been any time in the last 10 years. Northwestern had 4. Minnesota had 3. Purdue and Illinois barely make the list because they each have only finished in the top 25 once in the last 20 years. So they barely make the cut. And Colorado, same boat, one time, but now we've got the Colorado and Nebraska playing in the Big Ten. So now we have the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry. We have Wisconsin and Minnesota, and we have Nebraska and Colorado. So we have good conference rivalries. Next is the Big 12. The Big 12 is another conference that's going to have 13 teams. So you got Texas and Oklahoma and TCU, Kansas State, Baylor, and Utah, because of their 2 Pac-12 championship wins, they also make it into the upper division of the Pac-12 of the Big 12. And Oklahoma State has a conference championship as well. Then you have Texas Tech with 5 AP finishes, BYU with 5 AP finishes, Texas A&M only has 4. In the last 20 years, Texas A&M has only finished in the AP Top 25 4 times. Utah State has multiple conference championships. They get the call up, and they finished in the AP Top 25 3 times in the last 20 years. Houston is in the same boat. Houston has multiple AP finishes, and Kansas has 2. Okay, so that would be the new Big 12. The addition basically of the Utah schools, and Nebraska and Colorado go to the Big Ten. So it looks fairly similar. It's just now we've got the 3 teams from Utah, part of the Big 12. And last we have the Pac-12. It's basically the original Pac-10 with a couple additions for the most part. So we have USC, Oregon, Washington, Stanford, ASU, Cal. All of them have won a conference championship in the last 20 years. USC's got the national title in Oregon, and Washington have playoff appearances. Now, the most deserving G5 team gets the call up into the Pac-12, and that's Boise State. Boise State in the last 20 years has won 12 conference championships and finished in the AP 12 times. That's more times than Tennessee. Okay, that is 50% more times than Tennessee, the next best non-P5 conference champion. So I'm sorry, but Boise State, if you're looking at what they have done on the field, is the most deserving team to get the call up. Next, we have Oregon State. Oregon State has 5 AP finishes. UCLA only has 4, no conference championships. Fresno State, multiple wins as a conference champion of the Mountain West, and 3 AP top 25 finishes. And then San Diego State. San Diego State also gets the call up. And you have Arizona and Washington State. So again, you have basically the original Pac-10 plus Boise State, Fresno State, and San Diego State. So we add the 3 best teams from California and Idaho, keeping that compactness. Now, what you might notice, there are a couple teams that are currently in the P4, P5 conferences that are not on this list. Indiana doesn't make the cut. In 20 years, Indiana has never even finished in the top 25. Iowa State does not make the list. they get relegated to the G5. So if we're looking at on-field performances over the last 20 years, these would be the 73 teams that, based on their performance, are the most deserving. Now, again, Iowa State's only top 25 finish was in 2020. Again, we're not considering the 2020 year because of COVID. There's just way too much inconsistency across the board for that to be considered. So Iowa State's only other top 25 finish in my lifetime was back in 2000. So that's what it would look like if we looked at this rating scale. I hope you all enjoyed this. It was just a fun exercise in creating the perfect P6. Now, again, if we were doing a 16-team playoff, then here's what I would say. Those 6 conference champions, because you're getting more than half of the college football teams in college football would get a shot. You win the conference, you get an AQ. So those 6, and then plus the next 2, I believe there would still be about some 57 teams left over, somewhere around there. I can't remember exactly, but those teams would maybe get grouped into another conference, and maybe if I have a whole lot of extra time on a weekend, I'll go through and research, and I'll group the remaining teams that and put them into a perfect conference. But I don't think anybody would actually care about that, so probably not. Anyways, my name is Chris Manning. This is the Liberty's Last Refuge podcast, and I hope if you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and share this video. Thank you all, and you have a wonderful day.